Why you wanna fly, Blackbird? You ain't ever gonna fly. Why you wanna fly, Blackbird? You ain't ever gonna fly. No place big enough for holding all the tears you gon' cry. 'Cause your mama's name was Lonely and your daddy's name was Pain, and they call you Little Sorrow, 'cause you'll never love again. St. Francis saw me crying outside of a bookstore near the entrance. I wouldn't have noticed if it hadn't been for him tapping my shoulder, proclaiming this place isn't big enough, before he sideways stepped through the open glass door, spilling out Nina Simone's Blackbird voice. Why you wanna fly? Signs, I'd always believed in them. Grounded for years after Angel took his leap and fell, unintentionally clipping my wings. I might have leapt then if Francis hadn't returned with a paper and pen to sit beside me. So I asked, what do we do with the lonely? And he sang the same thing you do with the pain. Our eyes are endless wells big enough for holding every fallen star's light. And I started to write all the tears I had already cried, wondering, is it possible for any of us to ever love again? So, oh yeah, thank you. It's always awkward. It's always awkward when you do like the heavy poems and then you do it and then people are like, I'm like feeling the feels. Do I clap? Do I like sit in silence? Like, I don't know. So, just whatever feels right you can do. So the book is broken into 4 sections, and the first section begins with this First Nations author. His name's Richard Van Camp. He wrote this book called The Lesser Blessed, and I love this quote from it. It says, I have to tell you something I said, I'm not going to lie. I have to tell you, I have this God-shaped hole in my heart, and I think you do too. And I like that because I think whatever you believe in, whether it's God or the Creator or the universe or a higher power, I think we all have something shaped hole in our heart. We spend our entire lives trying to figure out what that is, right? Like, there's 2 important days in our lives, the day we're born and the day we figure out why. And I think once you find out what that hole is, you spend your life trying to fill it, maybe with negative things, but then hopefully good things. And for me, I think that is poetry, but also just being an Indigenous person that I am. I also believe in things like historical trauma and ancestral memory and things that are passed down. So to help me process that, which is what I use poetry for, I wrote this poem. It's called In My Mother's Womb. I came into this world incomplete, born with a hole in my heart. It happened in my mother's womb. Doctors have a name for it, call it congenital cardiovascular defect. My grandmother says it's the moon emptied of its many faces. It is against nature. Creation has a will of its own. Or is it a pact from the past made long ago? It happened in my mother's womb. The blood vessels closest to my heart didn't develop the way nature or the Creator intended. When the doctors say hereditary, my grandmother responds ancestrally in prayer, songs gifted to her like birds. My mother and I do not know the words, but when grandmother sings, she is calling on horses to run in on clouds to protect us, to save us. Long ago, there was a man who loved my great-great-great-grandmother. The love connected 2 people, 2 spirits so deeply it shook the earth. I imagine it, the way it should have lasted long after the moon, yet he left her. His leaving made this hole pass down in my grandmother's womb. Since I'm tapped into my ancestors right now, I'll read this poem I wrote for my grandmother. She was taken when she was a little girl from her reservation and put into boarding school. There were horrible things that have happened to people in boarding schools, and so after that, she did not feel like it was valued, her indigeneity or her language. So she didn't teach it to my mom or my aunties, and so by extension, I don't know it. But I really try to learn. Like, I think, all of us are indigenous to somewhere, whether it's on this side of the ocean or another. Like, we all come from somewhere, and I think it's important to learn our roots in whatever way we can. And so whenever I'm with my grandmother, I always try to ask her how to teach me phrases. And it's funny, she laughs. It's so hard for me to say them, but I wrote this poem based off that. It's called Learning to Say I Love You. My favorite conversations are with my grandmother while she teaches me words in Indian as she says. I ask, how do you say, where did you go? And where are you going? Questions that layer my tongue in ash, reminding me of fire, the taste. Each time I speak, the slow burn of every loss I have witnessed cracks my lips, go and going, axe singed into my bones, so I ask, teach me I'm coming with you. So it sits rock heavy in my mouth, because my tongue is at war with history. Boarding school, kill the Indian, save the man, acts of colonization, strain my pronunciation when I want to say, take me with you. It dissolves before I can stomach the sweetness of language, ours. I am losing, I am lost, lodged somewhere in my throat between decades of broken syllables. Teach me how to reach the ones who are born already running. Teach me how to talk to the ones who need it most, your universe. Gift me words that linger softly like dusk. There must be a phrase to contain wherever you go, whether or not you know where you've been or where you are going. I think I have time for 3 more. One of these, it comes from my experience teaching. So it was my first time teaching, and if any of you have ever taught, like the kids test you. They test you that first day. And so it's my first time ever teaching, and the student comes in. And it's funny because I'm a child of the 90s, so I used to have baggy pants and stuff, and teachers would judge me, and then I would be smart and then be like, oh, why do you dress crazy? But so it's funny and sad that I was judging this kid just based on how he was looked. So he had his shades on, his earphones. It's we didn't need shades because our class is in the basement, so there was no sun. And I was just inside my head, I was freaking out. I was oh my gosh, he's gonna test me. This is the one. If I let him run over me, then everyone's gonna run amok. Oh my gosh. So I just had an intense time with this student. His name was Patrick. But he turned out to just be this amazingly gifted student, and so he was my student for 3 summers in a row in creative writing. And so, by the 3rd class, by the 3rd year, I'd known him. No more shades, but he still had his iPod on, and I was fine with students listening to their music when they write. But anyway, he was just an amazing student, and I remember, obviously, I have an obsession with love because my book is called Words Like Love. But so I'm passing out this poem, and while I'm passing it out, I said, okay, who's going to volunteer to read the poem? And then Patrick says, oh, I'll read it. But then when he gets the poem, he sees that it has love in it 20 times, and he says, oh, I'll read it, but I'm not going to read that word. And I was like, what word? And he's like, that one. And I was like, oh, love? I was like, okay, well, just every time you get to that word, just look at me and I'll do all the loves. It'll be a collabo poem. And so just also as a teacher, it's really important to me not to take advantage of or use my students. So I wrote this poem after Patrick was 18, and I let him read it to see if he was okay with it. I said, I want to write this poem, I can change your name. But he was so happy, he loves it when I perform it. So it's called Patrick Would Never Say the Word Love. Patrick would never say the word love. So when he volunteers to read the poem for class that day, he does so only on the condition that he doesn't have to say that word. So he reads, and when he gets to that word, he pauses, looks at me, and waits for me to say it, love, before continuing. Sounds a little something like this. The saddest thing in the world has got to be with you. Love. Someone unable to provide the love and support you need. And actually do it like this dramatically, perhaps to make my students laugh as I fill in the gaps. You see, Patrick, he's one of the most talented students I've ever had. He scores his pain beautifully on the page like he's constructing arias for operas with poetry. Patrick makes sense of things, his remembering, like his mother's drunk driving, her suicide attempts going off a cliff with him at her side. After all, what kind of mother would want to leave her child behind? In another piece, Patrick calls himself a bird without wings. After class apologizes for always writing such sad things. But he can't help it, he says. The teacher in me tries to recreate reinforcing messages like sometimes it's the sad things we need to write. in order to release, let go, break down, and cry. I tell him maybe try to incorporate music. I know it lifts me. His response, Miss Tanaya, I don't think I can sing. I say, baby, it doesn't matter whether you're on or off key. It's about honoring and using your voice. His song of choice, I believe I can fly. The next day, Patrick rips between verses. I used to think that I could not go on, and life was nothing but an awful song. And he hits every note to the back of his throat. I can hear past anger turn into harmonious hope, and though he still won't speak it, Patrick sings it. Later he'll tell me there's a difference, but now I know the meaning of true love. Performing his piece inspires the quiet. This other girl who sits in the back of class raises her hand, says she also believes she's a flightless bird, but maybe she too can learn to rise with music. So she asks if she can share. No longer scared, she begins. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me. Her voice leaps up the page. Her cantatas are rage, written in jagged lines to release memories growing up in a household where her mother's boyfriends came into her room at night. And it was then, in the darkness, that she wanted to rise into flight. Where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops, that's where you'll find me. But they pulled off her wings. As a flower de-petaled, she goes on to tell us this continued from 3rd grade until just last year. We are in tears when she's finished. She rips up her paper, places pieces on her tongue like sacrament, thinking if she swallows the words, this simple act might save her. So I sit beside her, put a piece in my mouth too. I want her, then the class, to know that you don't have to eat your rage, pain, and sadness alone. But they don't know that I need to eat these words too, to feel full, that once I lost a friend who I loved. When he killed himself, his body hung from rope like pendulum, marking the times I never said it enough. So today, I make sure I speak, teach, pray, and say love, maybe even too much. I'll play love on repeat, my love, my love, my love, my love, when my students write pieces weighted in grief. So when the flightless sing, birds fly over the rainbow, why? Then oh, why can't we share in the experience? The class joins in, puts pieces in their mouths too. Together we can dissolve the heaviest words, turn to notes into chords to create a common chorus. I believe I can fly if I just spread my wings. Together we can all fill in the gaps for those who need help, not just saying, but believing in words like love. Thank you. For one more. So this last one is the last poem in the book. So it's just been an interesting journey, right? Just being a writer, going to school like someplace like Stanford and going to someplace in the Southwest. And I knew when I wanted to be a writer, I remember going into a bookstore when I was younger, asking to find like my favorite Native poets, and like, why can't I find them on the poetry section? And they would always be under the Southwest section. And so as a writer, I really struggled at first with what I wanted to write about, who I was as a writer, because I didn't want to end up just on the Southwest Studies section in like a Barnes & Noble. So I really struggled with like writing about where I come from for a long time until I finally, like, who am I writing for? Like, why am I writing? And I know I'm writing for my community, my people, but also, like I said, anyone who believes in love. Like, those things are universal. So I put everything into this book. And so, I struggle a lot with form. And the last poem in the book is my most spoken word-ish poem. So I think that's getting to be my voice more. Anyway, I wanted to call this one If I Could Turn Back Time, so I can make a funny share joke, like, if I could turn back time, just because I like to sing. But I performed it for these middle schoolers in Minnesota, and they had no idea who Cher was, so I felt like really old. And then I said, okay, well, you guys tell me what I should call it. So they said I should call it Back to the Beginning. Sometimes I wish we could start back at the beginning. Turn our existence into a videotape, call it life. Then push life into a VCR, press play and pause and get the chance to rewind with our image still on screen, watching everything that ever meant anything reverse with the push of a finger. If we could press rewind, the wrinkles on these God-given shells would smoothen into soft, unscathed skin. We'd awaken from tombs, arise from the earth like trees living to become seeds, and I guess that means as babies, we'd go back into our mother's wombs. If we could press rewind, mothers or fathers who abandoned their sons or daughters wouldn't walk away, but return, run backwards, turning towards their children so they would never have to look into eyes that ever saw them as unworthy of keeping. History wouldn't repeat, but instead fold into itself like disease-ridden blankets, rolling themselves back up like yo-yos, returning to the hands that ever made those hateful gestures in the first place. Battles wouldn't end in bloodshed, but instead ride off into a sun rising with warriors always returning from war, or boarding schools with their hair flowing behind them in lengths of rivers. Rewinding would mean going back to school to unlearn all the lessons ever taught to us. We'd start books at their ending, unstring sentences into letters until all we were left with was sound, waiting to come out of our mouths. Like my friend Angel. His would open to fountain gallons of vodka from liver. His throat would spill it back into bottle after bottle after bottle that he'd set back onto the shelves of a liquor store. He'd walk out of it in a line so straight. It'd lead him to the day Angel's father cut off his wings when he left him fatherless, falling asleep on a bench. Rewinding, he'd unfreeze to death as warmth re-entered his body, convulsing, not in dry heaving, but reheating, detoxing into calm as snowflakes would slowly rise back up to the sky. Imagine the kind of miracle time travel, like needles sucking poisonous drugs from addicted veins, pills undissolving into wholeness, being pushed back into containers, fitting just right. Everything would be all right. And for our youth who contemplated taking their own lives or committed suicide, would feel blood flow back into open cuts, their veins pulsing with life that knows it's worth saving, so much that determined hands repeatedly pull away razors from wrists, leaving behind no scar, no trace, not even the memory. And any fist that hit someone in rage or abuse would loosen into outstretched arms to call you home instead of the bullet-shaped holes making their way back into the guns or mouths that shot them in the first place. If we could rewind, maybe I could remember if I ever said anything to hurt Angel. If we could rewind, my angel would be able to fly backwards, lift himself back up, and life would be breathed back into him as he unwrapped the rope from his neck to inhale sweet and ever-expanding air into his chest. If we could rewind, I could tell Angel over and over, I loved you, and it would always, always start with you alive and well and not me. I'd gladly give up every poem I've ever spoken, have my mouth call back each and every one of them from your ears back into my pen's failed attempts at trying to put back together the splintered pieces of our hearts, staring at a blank page, wishing we could begin again. Thank you.